Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Jonathan Cohn in conversation with Michelle Goldberg this evening and in support of his new book, The 10-Year War. A quick overview of webinars for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you might want to keep the chat window open during the event as I will be dropping links to purchase The 10-Year War from Literati. There's also a link to purchase books in the description right below me if you're watching later on YouTube. If you're watching live, you can, of course, submit questions for the Q&A using the Q&A feature available to you in the webinar at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of Jonathan and Michelle's conversation. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask if you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this month's or this year's or this week's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. So now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Jonathan Cohn is a senior national correspondent at HuffPost, where he covers politics and policy. The former senior editor at the New Republic, he has written for the New York Times, Atlantic, and Self, among others. He has won several awards and was called, quote, one of the nation's leading experts on health policy by the Washington Post. A graduate of Harvard, Jonathan grew up in Florida and lived for years in the Boston area before moving to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he lives with his family. And Michelle Goldberg became an op-ed columnist for the New York Times in 2017. She is the author of 3 books. The first was a finalist for the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism, and her second won the Ernesta Drinker Ballard Book Prize and the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. Previously, she was a columnist at Slate, a frequent commentator on radio and television. Goldberg's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Newsweek, The Nation, The New Republic, The Guardian, many other publications, and she's reported from countries including India, Iraq, Egypt, Uganda, Nicaragua, and Argentina. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and children. They can't hear you, but they can sense your applause through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Michelle and Jonathan into your living rooms.
Hey, thank you so much. So Jonathan, I guess one way I think, and tell me if you think I'm wrong about seeing your book this way, but one way you can see it as being structured around a series of near-death experiences for Obamacare, both in the creation of Obamacare and then, kind of since Obamacare came into effect. And given both how close a call it was in terms of passing it and how imperiled it seemed when Trump was elected, are you surprised it's still around?
Yeah, I am. I mean, looking back, it's funny because looking back, you can say, oh, clearly it was going to survive and it's all sort of was preordained. But no, it wasn't preordained. And I am actually looking back somewhat surprised. There's a logical reason to me why it survived, why it went forward. And it's the things I talk about in the book, all the forces that were propelling this forward. There was a lot of thought that went into how do you actually pass a healthcare plan through Congress, and then how do you make it resilient? There's the story I tell in the book. I don't know if you remember, but sort of towards the end is the day after the election when Donald Trump has been president. It's like a funeral in the White House, and Jean Lambrew, who's one of the big White House advisors, calls everyone, and everyone thinks it's dead, and she thinks it's going to live, and she was right. But yeah, no, I was surprised. I mean, it seems improbable even now.
And so what are the aspects of Obamacare that made it so durable?
I think it is 2 things. I think there are 2 parts of the law that made it durable, and then there's a dynamic in politics that made it durable. So in terms of what made it durable, in terms of the actual policy, number one, the idea of protecting people with pre-existing conditions. turns out to have enormous political power. And I think we've seen that very clearly in the last two elections when Republicans have been desperate to say, we are all for, protecting pre-existing conditions. We have I don't know if you followed the Alyssa Slotkin race in 2018, which was just one district north of Ann Arbor.
I did, although I don't think I realized that I don't think I realized that that's what brought her into the race until I read your book.
Yeah. I mean, she was, it's a story, I think a lot of people, I think it's powerful both because a lot of people know somebody with pre-existing conditions, and also it kind of hits that idea of basic injustice to everybody. Like, you shouldn't not be able to get health insurance. You shouldn't be stuck with the medical bills because you got cancer, or your child was born with a congenital condition. So that's one. Number two is a lot of people got insurance. And they now have it, and that is hard to take away. I was very struck by the sort of the prediction that Bill Kristol made back in the 1990s during the Bill Clinton healthcare fight, where he warned Republicans back then when he was a loyal Republican, and he said, "Don't you dare cooperate on the Clinton healthcare plan, because once the people get those benefits, you will never be able to take them away." And that has actually been the pattern in history, is that once people get these benefits, they don't. And 20 million people got insurance, and at some point you're going to have to defend that. The political dynamic is just any healthcare change is hard, and the same gauntlet of obstacles that stood in the way of passing the Affordable Care Act, then the just general institutional momentum of healthcare stood in the way of tearing it down. And so I think those were the three things that were most responsible. Also, and we talk about this later, one of the things in the book that I kind of changed my mind about as I was reporting it is, I don't know about you, but as a reporter, I'm very much of that generation where I think there's too much about individual personalities and political coverage, right? And I read Nate Silver. It's data. It's these big forces that shape politics, and just sort of thinking about the story that I told, how much individuals made a difference, specific leaders, specific staff, and just I think in terms of this specific, the Affordable Care Act and why it survived, the people who wrote it and implemented it, they were better at their jobs than the people who were trying to take it down. And so I actually think that mattered too.
Okay, so looking at the people who wrote it and implemented it, I think for a lot of people on the left are very critical of Obama. Retrospectively think that there's a lot of things that he could have done that been left undone. And part of your book is about how the Affordable Care Act, right, is this huge step forward, but it's also this kind of jerry-rigged Rube Goldberg kludgy solution, that's inelegant in a lot of ways and insufficient in a lot of ways. Tell me if you think that's right. But
yeah, exactly.
But so I'm curious if you think, because I think people who, looking back at 2008, they think, Obama had this huge mandate. He had a 60-seat, Democrats had a 60-seat majority in the Senate. It can seem like they could have done so much more. Looking back, do you think that then you read the book and you remember like, oh yeah, Joe Lieberman. So do you think, how much better do you think it could have been given the constraints they were working with?
Yeah. So, my general take, I'll start my general take and then I'll get into the specifics. My general take is it's very hard for me to envision getting a significantly better bill through Congress in 2009. I think you have to imagine a very different political environment. And frankly, you have to then, if you're going to wind the clock back, you have to wind it back to like 1990 and sort of have 10, 15 years of heading on a different path and building support. And even then, I don't know if you could do it. I think, and partly that's a function, I think, of public opinion, of what people want. And people have very conflicted, mixed feelings about healthcare. It's very personal. There's a way they talk about it in the abstract. There's a way they talk about it in a political campaign. And then there's a way they talk about it when it's their insurance. And I do believe the sort of one of the really big decisions that went into what the Affordable Care Act would look like. And this was baked in the cake before Obama got there. It was, and it came out of the failure of the Clinton healthcare plan, was we can't mess with people with employer insurance for people who have it. People who have employer insurance don't want to give it up by and large. And that sounds really strange to anyone who's ever had an issue with their employer insurance. They're like, why would anybody want this? I remember Bernie Sanders, who I think is great at this, by the way. He did that, I don't know if you remember, did a Fox town hall a couple of years, it was during the campaign, and he's like, who likes their employer insurance and wouldn't like Medicare for All better? And, everyone raised their hand. Oh, we don't like our employer insurance. And that's all true. The problem is that, like, when you get to the actual debate, then people start to look at what they're getting and they get nervous. So it's hard for me to imagine something dramatically there, because partly because of that, partly because of the way our government is structured, especially, and I feel like it sounds like a cop-out, but the United States Senate is a real problem. The way seats are apportioned. And yeah, they had 60 seats, but, as you were just saying, who were those 60? Well, it was Joe Lieberman, it was Ben Nelson, it was Blanche Lincoln, it was Kent Conrad. I mean, there were a lot of very conservative Democrats from conservative states, and keeping them on board was a real problem. They were not as enthusiastic about doing this in the first place. They were very paranoid, rightly or wrongly, about being painted as liberal Democrats. And, I feel like you can go through any individual decision that was made on any particular issue and say, could they have put more emphasis here or there? And I think looking back, did they have to work so hard to reduce the deficit? Did they have to put so much political capital into the Cadillac tax? I think, yeah, they probably could have done a better job on that. I think when I think about critiques from the left, the one I really think about is I think there was a mutual hostility that developed between the Obama administration and the left. And I think the left felt correctly they were being taken for granted a little bit. And, Obama in his memoir, I don't know if you saw in his memoir, he's got a line about this where he expresses he's very exasperated. It's like, what about 60 votes don't they understand? So I get that too. I just, at the end of the day, I think you move the needle a little bit one way or the other, but I just think the constraints were there, and there wasn't a lot more they could have done to get.
So you don't think there's any way that if they had made different decisions that they would have gotten a public option?
I really, that is hard for me. I mean, I hate to be definitive. I don't want to try to dodge your question.
Right,
like, is there a scenario where they get a public option? Maybe, but boy, I mean, at the end of the day, if you have, as long as they were going to need 60 votes. And remember, it wasn't like it is now. We didn't have this other book on the filibuster out, and everyone's talking about getting rid of the filibuster. And you couldn't do this through reconciliation. It was just too hard. I don't know. In a 60 vote Senate where votes 59 and 60 are Ben Nelson and Joe Lieberman, by the way, being cheered on by 6 or 7 other conservative Democrats who don't want to quite be out front on it, but saying we don't like the public option either. I just don't know how you get it.
So it's interesting what you just said about, it wasn't like it is now. How much do you think, sort of what it is now, where, even though Joe Biden, sort of by any stretch has a more conservative record than Obama did when he became president, right? They're kind of going into this with basically saying to the Republicans, if you don't like it, we're going to do it without you. And it's a very different, the Recovery Act is a very different kind of bill than healthcare reform. But there's you look back both in your book and in Obama's memoir about all the time they spent trying to get Chuck Grassley on board to give them, right, this this fig leaf of bipartisanship that the Republicans were just never, ever, ever going to give them. I'm curious how much you think the lesson of Obamacare and the fact that they were strung along for so long by Republicans who were never who were never going to engage in this process in good faith, right? And there's that moment when Obama says to Chuck Grassley, I think, like, if I give you everything you want, will you get to yes? Is that right? And Chuck Grassley is like, I can't guarantee it.
Yeah, I should say some people around Grassley say the context is a little different than Obama remembers it, but yes.
So how do you think that has affected, the generation of Democrats, many of them who are around for that, who are in the White House now?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly left a big impression, right? I mean, I'm sure you noticed, I certainly noticed all the times that, Chuck Schumer was like saying, we will not repeat 2009, we're not going to wait around. And I think, the fact that they've gone and, the way the budget reconciliation process works, listeners, most of you guys, if you're tuning into this, you probably know this already, but, this is this special budget, this special legislative track where you can get something passed with 50 votes. And they've already approved that for the COVID relief bill. I mean, that train has already left the station. Now, they may get Republican votes in the end, they may not, but this is for the big COVID relief package. So that certainly has been encouraging to me. There's a second factor helping this, and it's a little bit paradoxical, but I think having 50 seats is somewhat liberating. When you have 50, 60 seats, or as the Democrats said at the beginning, remember the beginning of 2009, they only had 58, right? Because it took them a while to get the last two, because the court disputes over the Minnesota seat, and then Arlen Specter had to change parties. There's no hope of I think Democrats now understand they'll get nothing if they don't try to get things, go with 50 votes. Whereas before 60 was like within reach. You're like, okay, we can do 60. And of course, 50 is smaller than 60, but the 10 that they lost are almost all like, it's the same ones who are causing problems, right? So that seat in Arkansas, it's that seat in North Dakota. So you have a party that really doesn't have that many conservatives left. I mean, there's Joe Manchin. And, we'll see how this plays out. My read, and I'm curious if this is what your read is on this, not to turn the tables on you, but my take is that Joe Manchin is a better team player than Joe Lieberman.
Oh, yes,
right?
Definitely. I mean, right? Like I'm not happy with Joe Manchin's stance on narrow tangent. I'm not happy with his stance on the filibuster, but he's from West Virginia. So it's not like another Democrat gets that seat.
Right.
And he was a team player on impeachment in a state that Trump won overwhelmingly. And he seems like he's going to be a team player on a pretty big COVID relief bill, even if he's not on things like the minimum wage increase. Whereas Joe Lieberman has such a particular place in your story. Maybe you could talk about that. I mean, I really think that, if you really are frustrated about the lack of a public option, and you don't like the exchanges and you're paying too much, I really wonder how much of that you can lay at the feet specifically of Joe Lieberman.
Yeah, I think you can lay a lot. And the story, just to retell it real quickly, it got to be the fall of 2009. And there's two committees in the Senate that do healthcare bills. There's the Health Committee, which used to be run by Ted Kennedy. He passed away, so Chris Dodd and then Tom Harkin takes it over. And even though their name is Health, they actually do less on health because of jurisdiction. The other is the Finance Committee, which is Max Baucus's committee, and they each produced bills. They were pretty different. So it's up to Harry Reid, who's the Senate Majority Leader, to kind of stitch these together. And he's got to decide what to do about the public option, because the finance bill doesn't have one. Conservatives don't want one. The health bill does have one, and the liberals do want one. And the liberals in the Senate are like, they've had it. Like they have been like, they've watched, this courtship of these conservative Republicans. The bill's gotten smaller than they wanted. There are these deals with the drug industry. Obama doesn't seem to be fighting for anything they care about. So they were determined to make their stand on this. And Reid has to balance that with, he's got the conservatives who don't want a public option. And by the way, backed by really powerful special interests, not just the insurance industry, but really like the hospitals, who are hugely powerful in Washington, because in a public option, they see that as a way to pay them less. And they were very agitated about this. And
it is a way to pay them less.
Oh, it is. Yeah, no, it was completely rational.
Right.
Now, hospitals, I mean, you can think it's the right thing to do and still say, if you're a hospital executive looking out for your self-interest, arguably, I mean, you could argue in the long run, maybe it's better, but no, for sure. I mean, they recognized the public option as a way to squeeze what they were getting paid, and they wanted nothing to do with it. So he goes to Lieberman, so the situation is there's a number of conservative Democrats who don't like this and are expressing their reservations in private and public. Two are really quite loud about it. One is Ben Nelson, who didn't want the public option. But he's going to come later because he's vote number 60. So you got to get to 60. And it basically looks like you can get pretty close, maybe, but Lieberman is 59. And Lieberman, background on Lieberman, for people who don't remember, he's a conservative Democrat from Connecticut, which is a little weird because Connecticut's a liberal state, but this has been his pattern, especially on foreign policy, but also on some other issues. He was Al Gore's running mate in 2000, which I think some people don't know. And they're like, really? But yes, he was Al Gore's running mate. And, I think a lot of people were excited about that because he would have been the first Jewish vice president and all that. He was very close to John McCain. He endorsed John McCain. I mean, think about this. The 2008 election, and Senator Joe Lieberman is endorsing the Republican candidate. And a lot of this was bad blood because progressives had turned on him in Connecticut because of his support for the Iraq War. So there's a bad relationship there. And of course, Connecticut is the headquarters for two of the nation's largest insurance companies. And Lieberman is saying, I no public option. He's like, if there's a public option, I will join a Republican filibuster and end this. And so Reed has to kind of put this all together. So Reed's first offer to Lieberman is, all right, what if it's optional at the state's discretion? You know, we won't say it has to be everywhere. And if you're in a conservative state, you don't have to have the public option. If you're in a liberal state, you can. Connecticut, with its insurance industry, they can lobby the state legislature and they probably won't have one. Can we all be happy with that? And Lieberman says no. So then, you know, this goes for a while. And finally, he puts together a committee, a group of senators to kind of, you know, with some conservatives and some liberals, which is what, you know, you do. And that's how you come to a consensus. And they came up with an idea that they thought would work, which was to have what's called a Medicare Buy-In, which basically said, you know, if you're 55 or 50, depending on the proposal, you have the option of buying into Medicare. And for public option advocates, this was like better than a consolation option, because there was a long, going back years and years, the thought was this is how you'll eventually get Medicare for all, to just expand it to more and more people. So they were psyched about that. And actually, Lieberman had endorsed it once or twice, or actually 3 times. And they thought, this is one of those, it's funny, when I was reporting the book, there were a number of times where I finally had to throw my hands up and say, I don't know what actually happened, because people remember it differently. So you get a different story if you talk to Joe Lieberman and if you talk to Harry Reid, than if you talk to Lieberman's staff and if you talk to Reid's staff. The Reid version of this is that Lieberman said, I will do this, I will support this. And then that was a Saturday night. They went to bed thinking that he supported it. On Sunday morning, Lieberman goes on Face the Nation and says, no, I won't. There's a Lieberman side version of this where he wrote a letter and said, I'm concerned about this. I don't want to do this. He felt like he was being boxed in, and he never promised to say yes on it.
Wait, and does that letter exist?
There is a letter. I've never seen the letter. I mean, there's a public letter which he expressed some concern, but it's one of those letters you could read 10 different ways and such. So, you know, at the end of the day, they, you know, Lieberman said no, and they were stuck. They were out of options. And Reid had to go to the progressives and say, this is it. I've run out of ideas. And I should mention, by the way, that Obama and the White House, they were like, when Reid told them he was going to go and try to get the public option, they were pretty skeptical. I mean, they thought it was done already. But they're like, well, if you want Harry Reid, you know your Senate better than we do. And, you know, eventually they had to give up on it. And he went to the progressives. And it was funny. One thing I learned in my reporting, you were talking about the near-death experiences of the law. I in my head had a couple during the 2009 saga. I mean, there's the part where like Obama's advisors are telling him in January, don't do this. And he says, no, I want to do this. And it happens again in August. And there's a couple other moments. I did not realize that moment when Joe Lieberman pulled the plug, how close it came to falling apart then. But progressives understandably were livid. Just, they'd had it. And they felt like, you know, that they'd given up so much, and now this was like the final straw. Yeah, that thing came closer to unraveling than I thought. And you know, at the end, what happened, and this is the reality of the politics, is, and I think this explains the dynamics of where the bill ended up. At the end of the day, the liberals wanted this more.
I mean, even Bernie Sanders ends up being such a team player.
Yes. You know, I thought I love the Bernie Sanders story, because you know, Bernie has a reputation for not being a team player. And, you know, I think in terms of general, like we talked about on Capitol Hill, he's not a deal maker, right? He's not the, you know, and he even says, you know, I'm not like a backslapper, you know, and he's also, his team traditionally, I don't know, this may have changed recently, but at least back then, he'd come in, he'd give his big speech. I want Medicare for all, you know, I want this, I want that. And he wasn't, you know, he'd give his vote at the end, but whatever. But, you know, he really was a team player. And I think he saw clearly that, you know, he used his leverage that he had to get something that he thought was important, which was, you know, he was holding out, but his holdout wasn't for, like, you know, most senators when they were holding out, was like, you know, I want a tax break.
Right, like the Cornhusker, right. It wasn't the Cornhusker. How do you say that? Cornhusker
kickback. You know, it was, I want billions of dollars for community clinics that help poor people get health care, which is a very Bernie Sanders thing. And actually, I have to say, of all the interviews I did, one of my favorites was Harry Reid, because he's just remembering all this. He's very fond of Bernie Sanders, actually. And he said, I never worried about Bernie Sanders, because I always knew he believed in doing this, and it was the right thing to do. And he would be there, and he would want to push it in the right direction. And he never worried about that. I don't want to put words in Harry Reid's mouth, but let's just say that he was not so effusive or friendly towards Joe Lieberman in retrospect.
Okay, so let's go past the passage of it. I mean, I certainly remember thinking, I remember, it's one of the worst nights of my life when Donald Trump was elected, and feeling like we were going to lose so much. And it seemed like this was going to be one of the things that we lost first. And right, I mean, I feel like not everybody, but a lot of people sort of remember, that moment of McCain coming out and turning his fist down, thumbs down. But there's like a bigger story to sort of the Republican failure to repeal it. And so is it just that, like, can you talk about that? Can you talk about like because part of the story you tell is the like total kind of policy making collapse of the Republican Party, right? But like that they were just incapable of coming up with, it wasn't of coming up with kind of even like a shell of a replacement.
Yeah. So I mean, it's funny. When the first repeal bill, right, lands on the desk the day that Obama signs the Affordable, literally the day, March, 23rd, 2010, there's a bill filed by Jim DeMint. We're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but it just says that, it doesn't replace it with anything. They keep saying, we're going to repeal, we're going to replace it. We're going to replace it. Here comes the replacement. And they never do. And, I think there were a couple of things going on here. One of them is that in general, and again, I was very grateful to the Republican staffers and officials who talked to me about this. And one of them was very candid about it. It's like, Republicans don't do healthcare. It's just not it's not a subject that attracts a lot of thinkers and policy experts on the right. So there are a few, and who are out there, and there's a few members of Congress, but this is not something they take seriously as an issue in the same way they do, say, national security or taxes, which you can see they spend a lot of time. If you read policy journals, there's a whole lot. I mean, you may or may not agree with it, but it's out there. But in addition to that, the dynamics of the Republican Party are changing. They're becoming, so there's this long-term sort of move that's sort of taking them further and further away from the center of American politics, and more just being totally rejectionist. Is rejectionist actually a word? I don't know. Is it?
I think it is. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to trust you on that. So rejectionist, of the welfare state, right? I mean, it's not enough to downsize it. It's not enough to limit it. No, we oppose it in any form. And the sort of, again, I would say symbol of this is Jim DeMint, who I was talking about before, who just wants to get rid of the entire edifice of the New Deal and the Great Society. So you have a more extreme party, and it happens over time. The moderates are sort of dying off literally, and they're being replaced by these arch conservatives. There's also a change in the incentive structure and the way Congress works, where more and more political currency in the old days, right, is your ability to deliver legislation, right? Mm-hmm. It's deliver, I can deliver appropriations, I can do something for my district. And more, the sort of incentive is, I got on Hannity, right? Mm-hmm. I got Americans for Prosperity is going to campaign in my district. And there's an outrage cycle that begins, and it feeds on itself. And so you keep, the party keeps needing to take these very extreme positions that are hard to square with actual policy. And so you never want, and you never start, and you don't think about the policy because you're not really going to pass it anyway. And so for years, I draw this contrast. It's so opposite to me from what the Democrats did leading up to the Affordable Care Act. I mean, whether or not you like their decisions, they spent 10 years obsessing over how to do this. And they had policy conferences, and they thought through a strategy, and they knew they had different wings on the party, and they got together. They said, you compromise with you, but this wing is going to compromise with that wing, and we're going to build alliances, and we're going to get our grassroots supporters so that when Obama gets elected, they can hit the ground running. None of that happens on the Republican side. And you can tell in part because there were a handful of people trying to do it, and they got no attention. They couldn't get anything. They couldn't get any attention to their ideas. They don't have any of these discussions, and then they get elected in 2016. They have all this, this power, and now oh, wait a minute, we actually, need to write a bill, and they haven't done their homework, right? And they haven't figured out all these very basic decisions they need to make. And
how much do you think they actually wanted to repeal it, or how many people do you think within the caucus really wanted to repeal it, and how many of them felt like they had sort of caught the tiger by the tail, since they sort of knew that they had nothing to replace it with, and that people were going to be really mad that they had taken this thing away from them, that they had only ever opposed as vociferously as they did, right, as you said, like because of the Obama part, not because of the care part.
So there was, there's this core ideological, well, I didn't want to say that. There was a core absolutely committed to repeal. It's actually hard for me to disentangle why they wanted to repeal. I'm not 100% sure how much of this was ideologically, I hate this. I've thought through what this thing is. I hate it. I want to rip it out, root and branch. How much of this was, this is the symbol of everything I don't like, and the people who are taking over the country. And I do mean people who are taking over there's a racial element to that. I don't think that's,
well,
subtle.
There's a racial element running through this entire thing, going back to like Harry Truman, right? That people are afraid that this is going to integrate. And it seems like, I just wrote about this other book by Heather McGee called The Sum of Us, where she sort of argues about racism is like the reason why we don't have a welfare state. And you could totally see that running through this book, right? That like the reason that we don't have a decent healthcare system in this country is because racism kept derailing it over and over again.
It absolutely keeps derailing it. And, it plays the politics. It gets caught up in the politics of welfare constantly. Like, I'm going to give money and it's going to go to somebody else. That was such a powerful, and not just anybody else, but me, white voter, I'm going to pay taxes that are then going to support this Black person's benefits. I'm always struck by like the single worst political moment for the Affordable Care Act when it was being written, right? Is that moment when Obama gives this press conference when he's supposed to be talking about healthcare. And the last question, he takes a question about, Henry Louis Gates getting arrested in Cambridge. And I remember that because it's the only time in my life I've ever been at a White House press conference, and I was all healthcare. So I was like, oh, this is great. He's talking, walking out, and he's talking about Medicare reimbursement rates. And the last question I remember he went to, I think it was a Chicago reporter, and he gets the question about Henry Louis Gates. And the next day, that's all that was in the news, right? And he was blamed by everybody for racializing this, which, just as an aside, where we are now, it's so interesting to me.
Right, it's crazy that this was the idea that like a Black Harvard professor shouldn't be arrested going into his own house.
Yeah, that was not just controversial, but that was seen to reflect poorly on Obama, who, being Obama, said it in the most careful, nuanced, generous way possible. And, you zoom ahead to like what we have now, and again, I think that's a case where public opinion does change over time. Things like the Black Lives, Matter movement makes a difference. Awareness has changed. That would have been an innocuous statement today, frankly, for him to make. It would have been mild-mannered. People would have been, why aren't you being more angry about it? So yeah, race runs through this. And just to get back to the original thread on this, what eventually happens is, you were asking how many wanted to actually repeal it. I think there was a core that wanted to repeal it. There was a core that was sophisticated enough to know that we don't really, if this is going to be hard and we don't really know what we're doing. And then there were a bunch of members who, again, this is just not a party that is especially spends a lot of time thinking about it. And I think that's really important because, Democrats, even your backbencher Democrat, by which I mean like a sort of junior member of the House from some district in pick your own whatever state, probably thinks about healthcare. It's part of the Democratic Party identity. It's what you do. It may not be your number one issue. It's probably in your top three, and it might be prescription drugs as opposed to like access for the uninsured, but it's part of the gestalt for the Democratic Party. So Democrats spent a lot of time thinking about this. Republicans did not spend a lot of time thinking about it. Every Republican presidential candidate and Congress, congressional candidate and president who's had a major healthcare proposal, it's always been in response to Democrats. Oh, the Democrats doing this, so I have to have an alternative, or I don't have to have an alternative. But this is just not a place they want to go. And the problem was these are very different factions. They hadn't gotten together, and the biggest problem though was they did have plans. They had a vision. There is a conservative vision on healthcare. It looks nothing like the rhetoric on healthcare, which was we're going to give everybody good health insurance. And the moment they had to actually put out a proposal to be compared with, what the Affordable Care Act was, that is the moment when the politics turn around. And obviously, I give credit to people like advisors like Jean Lambrew, to President Obama, former President Obama, who said this. He was like, make them show you what they're going to do, because you may not think what we have is so great, but wait till you see the alternative. And, you'll see that.
So what do you think are our prospects for getting beyond Obamacare, right? Like, obviously, Biden has said that he's going to try to pass a public option, which seems like a hard thing to do with 50 votes. Most people, I think, in the party, whether they think it's politically feasible or not, deep down want to get to something that looks like single payer. So what do you think is the trajectory of kind of healthcare reform going forward?
So, I mean, there's the easy stuff to do, which I think Biden is already doing. So, I mean, he got in, the Trump administration, they didn't repeal the Affordable Care Act, but they did make a bunch of little changes, very technical changes to formulas for calculating things like actuarial value, which, puts people to sleep when you talk about it, which is basically a way of calculating how good your insurance is. And they had a dozen of these changes that they turned the dials one way. So Biden's already turning them back, right? So he's going to undo that. And then the COVID relief bill does something really important that I think, the liberal Democrats in the Obama administration always had hoped they would be able to do, which was put more money into the Affordable Care Act. I mean, if I could go back and change something, and, I would put more money into it. It's underfunded. And that's the reason, if you're on your own buying insurance through like healthcare.gov, and you're middle class, you're not getting, because the financial assistance you get, it scales to income. So the higher income goes, the less assistance you get, the more expensive your insurance is. And it's middle class people who find these policies they buy, they're like, wow, this is a really high premium. I'm stuck with a really high deductible. Maybe the network doesn't have most of the doctors I want. You throw more money at this, and a lot of that goes away. And that's what they're going to do. And political conditions make that especially easy right now, because there's, throwing money is the one thing that's easy to do in healthcare, is throw money at a problem, because, you don't get
but I think people underestimate how important it is to throw money at problems, or maybe they used to underestimate how important it was to throw money at problems.
They do. And actually, I mean, again, going back to your earlier question about 2009 and replaying it, it's hard, the commitment to sort of making sure that the program actually reduced the deficit was a really big constraint on what they could do. Because even if you wanted to spend more money, you had to find that money somewhere. And of course, that's always the hard part. To be fair, part of that was political necessity, because you had a bunch of conservative Democrats who were like, if this runs up the deficit, we're going to get in trouble. And we won't talk about the hypocrisy of that or whatever, but that's all of it. Right. So I do feel like putting more money would make a huge difference. I mean, a really big difference. And I think it's interesting at this particular moment, you can spend money pretty freely for a combination of reasons. We're in a crisis. Also, I think this is another place where public opinion and elite conceptions change. I mean, the fact that we had a book called The Deficit Myth that was a bestseller, and lots of people on the left arguing we don't need to worry about deficits so much for like the last 5 years, has actually changed elite opinion, which matters in something like
well,
this.
When you think about how much the Obama administration, maybe this was inevitable given what people thought about economics at the time, but like they sabotaged themselves on both the Recovery Act both the Recovery Act and the Affordable Care Act, just because they were so afraid of the word trillion. Yeah.
Now, I will say, if you talk to people like, Phil Shaliro, for example, who was the, legislative counselor, I mean, he will tell you that the pressure to do that was coming from Ben Nelson and Blanche Lincoln and all those people that they were trying to, they were very conscious of the votes. And, I've seen memos and they're not lying. I mean, I've seen, that, there was a lot. I mean, there were, some of the people in the Democratic Senate caucus, they were like, can't we just spend like $600 billion on the healthcare bill? Why do we have to go to $900 billion? I mean, there was a lot of pressure on that. But yeah, I mean, that was a huge limiting factor. And, putting more money into it is huge. Now, to get beyond that in a public option, I think the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is stronger, more vocal, and more focused than it was back then. And I don't think it would be possible to ignore that. and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, that's how politics works. And so I think they're going to have to do something that at least makes some, progress in the direction of a public option. How far they can get, as you said, with just 50 votes, I don't know. Do they get more votes after the midterm? That's an interesting question. I think public option looks more and more acceptable, in part because, Medicare for all is out there, and we don't want Medicare for all, but we'll do a public option. And it is a popular idea. And getting a Medicare for all, long term, I feel like, I think a policy lesson from the Affordable Care Act is, yeah, actually, that's a really good idea. I use Medicare for all in a very broad sense. It doesn't have to look exactly like Bernie Sanders' plan. I think you can have a role for private insurance for people, or, as an alternative or as a supplement, depending on how you structure it. But the basic elements that everybody just has insurance, and it covers, if there's out-of-pocket expenses, they're small, and the government is involved in setting some kind of global budget or setting prices. Like, I think those, all the European systems have that, even if they're not like what we would call Medicare for all. And I think you want to get to something like that. The one thing and just from having seen how hard this is, I feel like it's important to recognize that it's not an all or nothing thing. And I think of Medicare for all as a set of tools that you use, like, how much, those three things really are the sort of, how generous is the insurance? Does everybody have insurance? Is there government, some kind of government regulation of the money that's going out the door? And those are three things you can manipulate individually to some extent. If what Biden's proposing to do with the extra money for the subsidies, that's turning up the dial, making insurance more generous. And if we start to regulate hospital prices, that's turning that dial and you could turn the dial slowly, or you can turn the dial like whoosh. And I think how that plays out, I don't know. I think a lot of it depends on political organizing. I think it's remarkable what progressives have done and how much Bernie Sanders himself has moved the conversation. I think that's extremely impressive. And the last thing I'll say, and I don't want to go on, is that I think a lot of the people who talk about Medicare for all are now doing the work, that sort of unglamorous, grinding policy work that Democrats were doing before 2009 to figure out the numbers, which is so important so you can convince people. Like, that wasn't true a couple of years ago, but it's happening now. So I think that's important.
Okay, so I think I think I should probably turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, we do have a couple questions that we have time for, and we might have time for more. So if you do have a question, be sure to submit it using the webinar's Q&A feature. The first question is from Nicholas, who asks, Jonathan, has the fever finally broken? Will Republicans continue to run against the Affordable Care Act? Will they push again to repeal it?
That would be from Professor Nicholas Bagley at the University of Michigan Law School, who has been in the middle of these fights. I would say my theory, and then actually I would be very interested to hear Michelle's theory on this. My theory on this is that they will never stop. That wing of the party is not going to stop agitating against the Affordable Care Act. There's the part that's just motivated by the fact that this is still, a program they associate with Barack Obama, who raises all kinds of, anger and resentment. And then there's an ideological wing that believes very sincerely, in many cases, that they think this is terrible. The government's doing too much in healthcare. And so they will continue to try to undo it. I think what's going to change is the way they present it. And, in the same way that there's still people out there today in the Republican Party who want to get rid of Medicare, but they don't say they want to get rid of Medicare, right? No one runs against Medicare anymore. We're going to protect Medicare. And then, protecting Medicare turns out to be privatizing it and doing something else. And I think we'll see it take more of that form. And obviously that's important because at the end of the day, if you say you're protecting Medicare, there is actually a hard limit on how much you can do to wreck it. Like, at some point, the difference between saying you're going to protect it and what you're actually going to do does become unsustainable. Even, I think, maybe on Fox News, maybe not on Newsmax. I don't know. Michelle, what do you think? I don't know.
Honestly, I bet, not that I think the fever is broken, I think the fever is only getting worse, but I think that because it is less and less policy focused, it's not going to be, I would be surprised if it's directed at Obamacare in 2024, right? I mean, you have, the sort of populist wing ascendant, and it's not that they're ever going to embrace Obamacare, but they're not they're going to be less focused on, sort of Paul Ryan economics, which underlie the kind of intellectual umbrage that some of them took at Obamacare. And, like you said, I don't think that there's any of them that have either really the interest or the ability to craft an alternative. And I think that its kind of salience as a way to own the libs will be replaced by other sorts of things that they can do. So I don't, I don't see, the sort of Madison Cawthorn wing of the party or the Marjorie Taylor Greene wing of the party. I don't see that's what they're talking about, right? I mean, they're talking about immigration, they're talking about, Blue Lives Matter. I think that the sort of the impetus there's very little impetus, I think, for austerity in general right now in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then there are other targets, Lord knows, for them, and there's climate stuff, Green New Deal, and yeah, I agree with that.
Luke asks, I'm worried about the very high cost of healthcare and the degree to which it crowds other things out. What's the ACA's record at this stage on its cost reduction strategies? Any success?
Yeah, and that's another University of Michigan professor, director of their Poverty Solutions Project, Luke Schaefer. So this doesn't get a lot of attention. They spent a lot of time when they were writing the Affordable Care Act trying to come up with ways to save money, and there were sort of the big approaches, which were there was this change in the tax treatment of health insurance that came to be known as the Cadillac tax that never took effect and was eventually repealed. But there was a whole set of changes that came in, and they came from a lot of them were not inspired. They were pushed by Peter Orszag, who was the budget director, and Zeke Emanuel, who worked for Peter Orszag, who a lot of people know as a physician and philosopher, and see him a lot talking about COVID now. Bob Kocher, who was also a physician, and there was a whole bunch of ideas around how everyone agrees that like our medical care system is wildly inefficient. It puts money into the wrong things. We reward volume, not quality. What can we do to sort of reorganize the way we pay for healthcare? Some of those are actually, those experiments are actually showing promise. One in particular, it takes a while to figure these out and see, you have to study them and see, like you have to do these research studies to see if they really are going to save money over time. But, things like this thing called bundling payments, which basically says, you pay, instead of paying, for like a knee replacement, instead of paying like each physician and each hospital and whatever, you just sort of one person manages the care, and then they, the money is sort of divided up. Some of those look promising. The problem is like, they're like, if you think of like a curve on healthcare spending, like, they move it from here to here. And what Luke was saying is right. I mean, the impetus, we were talking earlier about like, why were they so determined to reduce the deficit? To be fair to them and to give them their due. And I think what the reason was, there was a sense that we're spending so much money on healthcare as a country, it is crowding out other things. It's less money sticking around for other purposes that we could spend it on. And, I think that's true. It's certainly true at the state level, we see it. So, but I do think the flip side of that is, given what we've seen abroad, and I think a lot of even more conservative economists are starting to come around to this now, there's another way to control costs, which is the government dictates the cost. It sort of sets a limit on spending. It sort of fixes prices. That's what they do in other countries. Now, that is like politically really hard to do because, as we know, tell the hospital industry you're going to regulate their prices, they will fight. And let me tell you, people don't think of hospitals as like lobbyists, but every congressional district, almost the single biggest employer is a hospital. And the people on that board of that hospital, I promise you, are really good friends with the member of Congress. And they have enormous influence when the CEO walks in and says, well, if you want to regulate my prices, that's fine, but we're going to have to close the trauma wing so people will be dying after their car accidents. And by the way, we're going to lay off 500 low-income workers who do bill processing. Yeah, that's hard to do.
I think we have time for one more question. Anna writes, do you think the branding Obamacare did more to help or hurt the ACA?
I'm gonna answer real quick, and then I want to see what Michelle says. My feeling is it hurt. It was branded that way, obviously, by the Republicans, and then eventually, I think the Democrats decided they couldn't run from it anymore, and Obama was like, "Well, fine, we'll call it Obamacare." I actually think, I mean, it's a silly little thing. They never really came up with a good name for this. Like, Medicare is Medicare, Medicaid is Medicaid. If they'd come up with a better name for it, maybe that would have helped a little bit. I mean, I still think the end of the day, the politics were what the politics were, but the name didn't help. I say that as someone who writes about it all the time and resisted ever using the word until finally I gave up. And of course, now it's in the subtitle of my book. So I really have no moral standing for this. But anyway, I'm curious what Michelle thinks.
I think I agree with you that I think it hurt it for a long time. And I think now it is sort of a wash because the policy is popular and Obama is really popular.
I think
right. And so in a way, it's like, I think Obama's happy. It's almost like now, I mean, it was initially meant derisively, but now it's just kind of exists as like a tribute to Obama.
Yeah.
We do have maybe time for one more quick question. And Emily writes just asking you to talk about legal and court challenges to.
Yeah. So, I mean, the funny thing is this is all taking place and we've sort of been skating past it. Like the Supreme Court right now has a case in front of it challenging the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And this Supreme Court with 6 Republican appointed justices could, with the decision, wipe the whole thing out. Now, the assumption is, I don't want to say the assumption is, it seems unlikely because it is such a terrible legal case that even like the lawyers who brought the previous lawsuits are like, this is like bonkers. I mean, it's really, really bad. I won't explain it here. You cannot find a respectable legal expert who thinks it has like a leg to stand on. And during oral arguments, John Roberts, who saved the law twice when he voted to save it previously, was very skeptical, but so was Brett Kavanaugh, actually. Kavanaugh was like very dismissive of the case. And there were things from Alito and Gorsuch that made them say, I mean, even if you're a conservative, this is not like, a intellectually consistent conservative should laugh this out of court as quickly as an intellectually consistent liberal. So you hope it won't, you would think it wouldn't, but of course, I'm not going to like this Supreme Court. I don't know, Michelle. I mean,
I think I agree with you. I mean, I don't know any conservative who thinks it has a chance.
They seem to be more convinced it's going to fail than the liberals, I think.
Yeah, I think the conservatives are sort of like, this is ridiculous. What are you so worried about? And so I hope that's true, right? And I feel like we've seen in the last couple of months like some limits to what the Supreme Court will do when faced with the wing nuttiest of legal theories, on other issues. But honestly, who knows?
Yeah.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour, so I think it's time to end there. Thank you to everyone who submitted your questions. And Jonathan and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. And we hope you continue to stay safe and be well, and hope to maybe have you both in the store someday down the line for your next books. But until then, please take care. And to all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. You can, of course, purchase the book, the website, the bookstore's website, and the event page that brought you here. And if you're watching later on YouTube, you can, of course, find a link in the description below. But we hope you continue to stay safe and be well, and we'll see you at the next event. So take care, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
Bye. Oh, thank you.